Let's join together in prayer. Father God, we just give this time to you right now as we begin our study of biblical womanhood. Lord, will you come? Would you come and join us together in unity and oneness of spirit in the name of Jesus? Father, I pray that you will bless each woman that is taking part in this study. I pray that this will be a glorious time of discovery, of truth from your word. That lives will be changed, families will be changed, that you will be glorified in a new and brilliant way, so that every woman who goes through this study, every woman who is with me right now, will come out after doing 8 lessons full of truth to stand on the rock of your word in our shaky world. Father, I pray that you will give me ability to teach. May I speak with words of grace and truth. Keep me from error and bless this endeavor in the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. I think it's quite likely that you are going to find, as we get into this study of biblical womanhood in a postmodern culture, that the topic of biblical womanhood is much deeper and more significant than maybe you're thinking right this minute. It is a serious issue. It's a timely issue for all of us, and there is a lot at stake. Let's begin by taking a look at the serious nature of biblical womanhood today. We're living in strange and challenging times. I think you probably will agree with me on that. Dr. Al Mohler, in fact, says that we are at a hinge point in history, that there are seismic shifts that are taking place in our society, and that these shifts are changing the way we think. There is a challenge that we have today, and that challenge is that we must think according to biblical truth. If we don't, we're going to be sucked right into the cultural thinking of our day, which will lead us to confusion. This challenge, I think, is summed up well in Romans 12:2, and you have that verse in your student guide. Take a look at it with me. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." The first part of this verse addresses how we think. Are we going to think being conformed to the world, or are we going to be transformed by the renewal of our mind? Our challenge is to transform our minds so that we are not conformed or take on the form of the world's thinking. How do we do that? How do we renew our minds? Well, we test and we discern and we intentionally, regularly, seriously study and meditate on God's word. There's a reason for this, and it's a good reason. If we don't think biblically, we will, by default, think culturally. Think about that. We must think biblically, or we will, by default, think culturally. Now, what's at stake here? Well, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on us as Christian women. And what is at stake begins with us in the sense that our own personal happiness is at stake and the happiness of our families, but it goes so much farther than that. Ultimately, what is at stake is the very authority of Scripture and the reflection of God's glory to a dark and dying world. That's what's at stake in living out biblical womanhood in our lives and understanding the principles of biblical womanhood. So it's serious business. It affects us personally, it affects our families, but it also reflects upon the Word of God and on His glory as it shines in this dark world that we're living in. Let me give you some examples of what's going on in our world today by looking at the scriptures. It's comforting, I think, to know that although this is serious business, it's not new business. In fact, Paul wrote about this very issue in Colossians 2, verses 3 to 8. Now remember here that Paul is writing to believers, and these believers had a struggle. The struggle that they had was that they had false teachers that were coming right into their churches, and they were teaching an unbiblical philosophy. Let's read what Paul has to say to these Colossian Christians. He says, I want you to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures and wisdom and knowledge. Now I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. Remember those words, especially plausible arguments. Paul goes on to say, for though I am absent in body, yet I am with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and the firmness of your faith in Christ. Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. And see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. Again, think about these words that Paul's saying. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. These Colossians, just like us today, these Colossians are up against something called plausible arguments that are being presented in their church. The key word there is plausible. Arguments are no problem, are they? Especially if we are sure that they're wrong. These are plausible arguments. These are arguments that sound so good. But they're coming out of a prevailing philosophy of our day, and in the end, they're empty deceits. So it's not new to today. This is what we're facing. This is what they faced. We see it again in Paul's letter to Timothy. Timothy is ministering to the Christians in Ephesus. And Paul writes to Timothy and he says this, there are those in your church today who have the appearance of godliness. Circle that. Very similar to plausible arguments. There are those who have the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. There's that empty deceit. And what does he say that we're to do when these kinds of people come into our churches? He says, avoid them. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Oh, ladies, is this not what's happening today? There's a myth out there that says that a biblical woman is a weak woman, and that is not true. Biblical women are strong women. We do not want to be weak women. Weak women are those who are going to every class they can go to. Weak women are learning all the time. This book club and that book club, reading this, talking about that, and never coming to the knowledge of the truth of the gospel, to the truth of God's word, to the truth of Jesus Christ. That's what causes a weak woman. And when we're weak women, we are vulnerable. And when we are strong women, standing on the word of God, then we are not as vulnerable. So we are up against today the appearance of godliness in our own churches, the plausible arguments that sound so good, but in the end they deny God's power, and they are indeed empty deceits. How did we get here? How did we get to such a place? How did we get to a place where we have to actually define what it means to be a woman? To help us understand our times today, and this study is set in our culture so that we can see what's going on around us, and then we can discern and test and be transformed in our thinking so that we're not conformed to the world. To help us understand this, I think it is very helpful to have an overview of history, to have an overview of the philosophical development and the development of, pointedly, the development of feminism in America. I'm not a philosopher, and most of you are not philosophers, so I don't want to make this sound too hard or too lofty, because it won't be. But I want to give you a bird's eye view of how we got to where we are today so that we can understand what's going on around us. So just hang on. I'm going to go over this very quickly. It's a bird's eye view, as I said, and then I'll make a point that I think you'll get when we get finished with this little section here. Every age has a dominant or prevailing philosophy. And philosophies are not grassroots movement. The development of a philosophy doesn't begin at the bottom with the people and move up. Philosophies come from the top and move down. They begin in the academies, we call them, institutions of higher learning. Thinkers and writers begin to teach what they're thinking and writing about. And these things are taught, and then by those students they are consumed, and then they're lived out, and eventually they affect all of society. And from the prevailing philosophy of each age, certain plausible arguments then bubble up. Now, if God is left out, the arguments, the philosophy, become empty deceits that will capture us if we're weak and we're not biblically informed. This is what we call the slippery slope. Mary Cassian, in her book, The Feminist Gospel, has written about this, and she defines slippery slope. You'll see that in your student guide again. It says here, Mary Cassian's word, the slippery slope is a term meaning that provisional acceptance of a faulty presupposition will, if not for a certain individual, then certainly for the next generation, lead to its complete acceptance. What is the philosophy of our day? The philosophy of our day is postmodernism. That is the prevailing philosophy. That is what is permeating the institutions of higher learning today. That's what is permeating our educational system. And that is what is creeping into our churches, our households, and our hearts. Again, we go back to the question, how did we get here? How did we get to this postmodern world? And the answer is one prevailing philosophy morphing into another. I say morphing because that's exactly what happens. It's not a hard line when one philosophy ends and the other begins. It morphs, it changes gradually the way thinking goes in a culture. Now let's look over this. And you have a diagram in your student guide that you can look at in more detail as you get home. But I want to give you just a quick overview, historical overview of prevailing philosophies. And it takes us all the way back to, let's say, as early as Socrates, around 400 BC, and as late as René Descartes in the early 1600s. And the prevailing philosophy over this wide span of time was something called rationalism. Rationalism means that you think, you can reason, you think through things. René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Now during this time, there was an acceptance that God existed and that there was truth, and that we would reason things out. This was probably the prevailing philosophy at the time of Jesus. In fact, in Matthew 16, he uses that kind of thinking when he talks to the Pharisees and they're trying to trick him. And he goes back to them and he says, now you know, when you look at the sky, he says, and it's red at night, you know it's going to be a beautiful day tomorrow. And if it's red in the morning, you know that that very day it's going to be stormy. You can figure that out. You're thinking and have reasoning power. Now take that power, take that reasoning, and apply it to the spiritual truth that I'm trying to tell you. And of course, we know that they wouldn't do it. But he was appealing to their ability to reason. It was the prevailing philosophy of the time. However, that began to change, and men began to realize that it wasn't just all reasoning, but our environment has something to do with how we think. And we moved into an era of a prevailing philosophy called empiricism. Experience is the most important. This is the scientific method. Remember, when you were in science class, you had to take your facts, you did your experiment, you had the facts, but then you had to weigh them against and observe the environment. What we see in philosophies is that they often begin in the scientific area, and then from the science, they somehow get transposed into the social area, and then from social area into the spiritual. So you can remember that with philosophies. That's what happens here. Science, social, spiritual. The scientific method moved into how we think about ourselves socially, and John Locke said the mind is a blank slate. Well, we moved from that into a period of time in the 1800s when Charles Darwin came on the scene. Charles Darwin was a scientist. He did his experiments in the area of science. He wasn't thinking about social issues. But because there were men who wanted this same kind of thinking and reasoning that Darwin had, they moved it into something that Darwin had never really imagined, and that was social Darwinism. And then that moves right into the church. And the reason it moves into the spiritual area is because with Darwin, for the first time, God is denied. The supernatural is denied. And what happens then is that morphed right into something called existentialism. And Friedrich Nietzsche said, God is dead. He declared God was dead. There's no purpose or meaning to life. There was a rejection of reason. There was a rejection of God and existentialism. And of course, over time, this couldn't be sustained. And so we began, if God is dead, who begins to come to the fore? Man. And we move into the era of modernism. If God is dead, then human reason is the final arbiter. And so in this time, when modernism began to come into our prevailing way of thinking, into the prevailing philosophy of the day, we begin to have all the isms. Humanism, Marxism, fascism, socialism, communism, and it moves into the church as theological liberalism and liberation theology. Atheists began to rise up. We can define an atheist, you know. God does not exist, and I hate him. Now that doesn't even make sense, does it? But that's what was coming out of modernism. Truth is there, but God is not. And of course, we know we cannot live like that. And this is where we get the term postmodern, because we tried to bring the supernatural back into our thinking. But in postmodernism, we have a very eclectic kind of system. Nothing is certain. Relativism is the key word of the day. And we have in our day then almost a deliberate confusion. A confusion between modernism and postmodern thinking. The point here, as we've gone over this brief history of philosophies, the point I want to make is that philosophies come and go. They change. But God's Word never does. That's why we want to stand on the truth of God's Word in our shaky world. It's important to understand our times. It's very important to understand how people are thinking and what affects how we think. But it's more important to understand the Word of God and take our stand on the Word of God. Well, postmodernism is the philosophy of our day. It defines our world. It defines our thinking, our behavior. It's the water that we swim in and the air that we breathe. We live in a postmodern world. Now, what are some tenets of postmodernism? What does this look like? And I'd like to just share with you 7 tenets of postmodernism. The first tenet of the philosophy that is so overwhelming in our day is that there is today an unlimited variation of words. We live in a culture where words don't always mean what we think that they mean. People misspeak. We misunderstand. We even have a word for it. It's called spin. We have spin rooms. You've watched a presidential debate, and afterwards we all go into, by camera, the spin room. And representatives of each candidate tell you or reinterpret to you what their person said, as if we didn't understand what they were going to say. Therefore, we have no point of reference, do we? There's a sense that the ground is always shifting underneath us because we're not quite sure what those words meant. The postmodern mindset encourages readers of a book, for instance, or a text of any kind, to establish their own interpretation of that text. And so, in other words, when you receive something, you are interpreting it any way you want to. The reader interprets the text, not the author. Now, we know that that is simply crazy, isn't it? If you receive an email from someone, you don't receive that email and think, well, I'll just read into this anything I want to. No, you're looking at that email and you're thinking, what did that person mean when they sent that to me? What's the meaning, not behind just the words, but the person who sent it? But the mindset of the postmodern wants to put all of the responsibility of interpretation on the one who received the email, the one who's reading the text. Now, this comes into our churches, doesn't it? And we get into Bible studies where we have discussions about what a passage means to me. And tell me what it means to you. And the question that we need to be asking is, what did this mean? What did Paul mean when he said that? Let's go farther back. What did God mean when he put that word in his word? That's completely opposite of what the postmodern mind wants us to think. And if words have no meaning, then we can change words, can't we? And if we want to call father mother, we have perfect license to do that. And so words become shaky, and when words become shaky, we move to a second tenet, and that is that logic becomes very shaky. There are no rules of logic to govern our discussions. If words don't mean what we think they mean, then how can we ever have a logical discussion? It's impossible. Have you ever had these discussions with people lately? And it feels like you're nailing Jell-O to the wall. You don't know. You can't get down to the bottom to know exactly what that person's talking about. And so you can try to talk about a very serious issue, like abortion, for instance. But when you're calling a baby a fetus or tissue, how do you know what you're talking about here? Or you're talking about the family, but we don't know exactly what they mean by family. These are very difficult things to have logical discussions with people. How does this influence the church? Well, it becomes very illogical in our discussions about the Word of God. If Bible words can be changed, then the logic can be changed behind it. And we can interpret the Bible any way we want to. That leads us to a third tenet, and that is that there are in the postmodern world, the world that we live in today, in the postmodern mind and thinking, there just are no boundaries to define meaning. If you can't define words, little words, then you can take that out and you can see, I can't define meaning of the big things like life. There are no boundaries. Boundaries are to be pushed. The so-called freedom, liberation. An example of that, I believe, is a man who really pushed the boundaries. He was an early postmodern thinker, and his name was Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, early postmodern thinker. He pushed the boundaries. He thought that moral boundaries were there to be pushed to the extreme. Michel Foucault, in 1984, at the age of 56, died of AIDS. That's what happens when there are no boundaries. It's tragic. It's tragic. How does this influence the church? Well, we dismiss the moral boundaries of God's Word, don't we? If we take this kind of thinking from our world and bring it into our church, we lose the moral authority of God's Word. And so we focus on God's love, which of course is very important. But then we take that and we say, well, then if God is love, He couldn't possibly mean that adultery is sin, for instance. Or that my heart is deceptive. And so we translate this kind of thinking right into how we think about those things that are of vital importance in our hearts. Now, this next tenet is one of the most important ones, and one that you're going to remember throughout our whole study. And that is that in the postmodern thinking, there is no such thing as a meta-narrative. Remember that word, meta-narrative. A meta-narrative is an overarching story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everything is connected in the whole story. When we have a meta-narrative, we have a basis of truth because we have something that we check our facts against. The pieces fit together. We have history. And history develops and we learn from history. But a postmodernist will not believe that there is an overarching story. Life is just a collection of short stories. The postmodern mind refuses to connect the dots. Everything's disconnected. Everything's random. And this is exactly the way they want it. Now, when this happens, it takes away truth, doesn't it? When this happens, it takes away authority and accountability, which of course is the point. How does this influence the church? How does this influence your thinking about God's Word? Well, the Bible just becomes a collection of short stories. So we can take it out of context. We can look at this story and we can look at that story and we can take this scripture and we can build a whole theology on it, and nothing is connected. Of course, that isn't the case, is it? God's Word is indeed a meta-narrative. From Genesis to Revelation, you will discover this as we get into our study. It is a full, complete story, and we are part of it. The fifth tenet of postmodernism is the defiance of authority. Without a meta-narrative, as I said, there is no authority. Without authority, well, there is no author, is there? keep that in mind. The root word of authority is author. And so if you begin to get rid of authority, then you're getting rid of the author. You do not have to be accountable to anyone. No rules, no laws. How does this influence the church? Well, we don't like authority in the church. We see that so often in so many of our churches. We will do anything in the church to get away from anything that looks like authority. And so the pastor will walk around and wear casual clothes and tell stories. There's nothing wrong in that in essence. But think about it. Why are we so afraid of authority of God's word and of declaring it? We have to be careful to see how much is our culture influencing what we're doing. The sixth tenet is the destruction of truth. The postmodernist literally is just taking brick by brick apart the pillar of truth. There is no truth. Truth is a name that we give our preferences, Nietzsche said. Truth is made, it's not found. Certainty today is considered arrogant, and uncertainty is seen as humility. It's a crazy mix, isn't it? It's a crazy mix that's upside down. And what happens in the church? Well, we become uncertain then. We become uncertain about the truth of God's word. And the key phrase would be tolerance. Or there's just not one way to God. There are many. Because we can't be arrogant and say there's only one truth. And the last tenet of postmodernism, I think this is the word that probably sums it up best. And if you don't remember any of these others, remember this one, relativism. Let's just read Pastor John Piper's illustration of relativism in these quotes. Let's read them together. This is the essence of relativism. No one standard of true and false, right or wrong, good or bad, beautiful and ugly can preempt any other standard. No standard is valid for everyone. What does this imply about truth, he writes? Relativists may infer from this that there is no such thing as truth. It is simply an unhelpful and confusing category since there are no external, objective standards that are valid for everyone. Or they may continue to use the word truth, but simply mean by it what conforms to your own subjective preferences. You may prefer the Bible or the Quran or the Book of Mormon or Mao's Little Red Book or the sayings of Confucius or the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Or your own immediate desires, or any of 100 other statements. And in that case, you hear the language of true for you, but not true for me. In either case, we are dealing with relativism. The influence on the church of relativism is that evangelism no longer seems like a very good thing, because we become uncertain about our faith. And it may be true for us, but what you believe is true for you, and so I have no right to tell you the truth with a capital T. Well, we're going to revisit all of these principles of postmodernism, especially when we get to lesson 7 in our study. We'll look at how these tenets affect our society, our churches, and even our own thinking. But right now, I just wanted to lay the foundation for you and just to perk up your ears so that when you see these things going on around you, when you see yourself thinking in this way, that you will be more aware of your times. Let's just close this section by giving a little comparison of modernism and postmodernism. I think it helps us to understand the day when we see it in comparison. Remember, these two have morphed together, and so we have a little bit of modernism still in our society today, but the prevailing philosophy is postmodernism. But in modernism, we see that there is a distorted sense of certainty, and in postmodernism, we have this elevation of uncertainty. For the modernist, what's the answer to every question? It's education. Truth exists, and if we can just know it, if we can just get enough of it, we can solve all of our problems. For the postmodernism, it's almost the exact opposite. For the postmodernist, there is no absolute truth. Therefore, there's no absolute answers. And when you stop and think about it, then there must not be any absolute questions. The basis of modernism, if we were to put these down into just two easy things to remember, modernism is truth without God. And postmodernism is God, but no truth. And what we're after as biblical women is truth with God, the two together. Out of our postmodern world, then, we have a variety of plausible arguments that are rising up out of that postmodern thinking. But the one that we want to begin to zero in now, we want to narrow our focus now as we get into our study, is on feminism. We want to think about how this affects us as women. In your student guide, you have a chart that shows you a history, and you can read this, a history of feminism in America. And what I want to do is to just try to put this in context for you so you can understand why we're even having a study today on biblical womanhood, why we're talking about it. If I were going to put this into just a capsule for you, I would say that look at the history of feminism as coming in two stages. The first stage began in the late 1700s and extended to the early 1900s. Women during this time fought for and they gained things like the right to vote, property rights, equal access to education and to the professions, equal pay for equal work. There were some really good things that came out of this. And the push at this first stage of the feminist movement, so to speak, was a push for equality. Equality for men and women. They got these things. They won these things. And then by the 1930s, the women's movement kind of just lay dormant. There was a lot going on. There was a depression. There were a couple wars being fought, especially World War II. In the 50s, the Korean War. And then women began to think. And some talk began to be circulating in the late 1950s, about 1957 in fact, something called the trapped housewife syndrome became very popular. There was a lot of talk about this. And then in 1963, Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. It's at this point, 1963, that we can actually put a flag in the ground and say, this was the second stage of the feminist movement, and something dramatically changed here. In fact, some have said there wasn't anything feminine about the feminist movement. The idea was to liberate women from their womanhood. That's not freedom, is it? But women were told that it was freedom. And what happened was that rather than pushing for equality, which really had been won, rightly so, there was a push for sameness. Now think about that. Think about sameness and what we hear today. How far has this come? Same-sex marriage? There's a sameness, there's an interchangeable thing going on here among the sexes, that there is no difference between men and women. We live in the backwash today of this feminist movement. And as you heard in your introduction, Danielle Crittenden put it very well. Many women today are feminists, and they don't even know it. Because it has happened so subtly, it has morphed into something that we live with today and take for granted. I would say that we are on the precipice of a third stage today called women's power, because we're not satisfied to just be the same. We want power. And that's what is happening today. We see it all around us, don't we? Women power. Well, this feminism came into the churches. And it came into the church as a plausible argument called evangelical feminism. It's feminism with a spiritual twist. Uses the Bible. It's a plausible argument because it sounds so right. But as you get into the Word of God and you look at it and you look at the truth of how we are made and God's plan and purpose for us, which is wonderful, freeing, liberating in the best sense of the word, you'll see that evangelical feminism is truly empty. There's a hollow ring to it. And the truth is that we're not satisfied to just be the same as the men. The truth is that the women want to be in power. We see whole denominations today splitting on this issue. It is an important issue, and we need to understand it. We need to understand where we take our stand so that we will not be blown by every wind of doctrine. Well, a summary statement. The prevailing philosophy of our day is postmodernism. The plausible argument is feminism. And that empty deceit is evangelical feminism. Let's just conclude today by agreeing, if we could, that there's some confusion. There's confusion about who we are as women, what roles do we play, how do we conduct our lives. Diane Posno is an author. She has written a book called Feminism, Mystique or Mistake, playing on Betty Friedan's book. And she describes this confusion, I think, very well. Let's read these quotes together. She says, many Christian women are unsure of the honored role that they have in God's design because of the confusion between their theology and the culture in which they live. She goes on to say, Christian women often become confused because they take the feminist dogma that they've been indoctrinated with and try to make Scripture bend to it rather than the other way around. Well, we don't have to live with that confusion. There may be something in your heart right now even that says, something's wrong, but I can't put my finger on it. It doesn't seem right what I'm hearing, but I'm not sure why. Well, we're going to clear up that confusion. And the way we're going to do it is to take our advice from Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon says this, if a stick is very crooked and you wish to prove it so, get a straight one and quietly lay it down beside it. You see, philosophies do come and go, don't they? And cultures shift like the sand. And our thinking becomes very shaky over really important issues that we're dealing with. But ladies, think about this. God never changes. His word stands the test of time. And in this study, what we're going to do is to take our stand on the rock. The Bible is the straight stick that we're going to lay down. And that straight stick is going to reveal the crooked and perverse thinking of the generation in which we live. What a joyful thing to look at the Word of God and to see that it affirms the truth in our lives. We do indeed live in a crooked and twisted generation. The Scriptures tell us that we are to do all things without grumbling or questioning so that we can be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Think about that. We want to shine in this crooked, dark, twisted generation as lights in the world. The light of Christ can shine through us. Throughout your study, you will find at the end of each lesson a little woman. You see her figure there in your student guide, and two lines, a straight line and a crooked line. The straight line points to truth from the scripture, and the crooked line points to down, on a downward slippery slope, to the thinking of our postmodern culture. At the end of every lesson, what we're going to do then is to take some time. I want you to take time, 5 to 10 minutes here at the end of your class, to look at the section called The Decisions We Face. Think over what you've heard today. And then look at these two things. Look at the truth of the scripture, and then look at what's going on in our culture and think through them, and then go to the next section, which is entitled Personal Application. Write down your answers there, and then write down your prayer. We'll do this at the end of every lesson. That little woman has a name, and next time I'll tell you her name. But right now, I just want you to take some time. You're not dismissed yet. Just stay here, stay in class, be quiet, don't start talking. Use this time to just download what you have heard and been thinking about today. Write your responses there, and then your class leader will close you in prayer. God bless you.